Let me reiterate thanks that Paul gave to the Humanities Festival organizers and to all of you for coming out on what has turned into a lovely autumn afternoon. I'm here to hear Alison Lurie and I attempt the impossible, which is to think in sort of a serious scholarly way about humor. And I just want to begin with a couple of words from some authorities about that project. Robert Benchley, the great writer, said, "Defining and analyzing humor is a pastime of humorless people." More to the point, in a more developed essay, E.B. White wrote in Some Remarks on Humor, analysts have had their go at humor, and I have read some of this interpretive literature, but without being greatly instructed. Humor can be dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process, and the innards are discouraging to any but the pure scientific mind. Being told by Benchley and White that something can't be done is reason enough, in my mind, to try to do it. So Alison Lurie and I are going to have a conversation about humor in literature, how humor works. Hopefully parts of it will be funny, and you will be glad you are here. And without further ado, I will turn over the power here to Alison.
Okay. All right, the question is, why do we laugh? We all have recently laughed, but it's hard to say why. It's a difficult, maybe even an insoluble question. From a physiological point of view, it's, quote, a respiratory convulsion which seems to be excited, whether we like it or not, by certain events which we experience. It's involuntary, like weeping or orgasm. Unless you're a very skilled actor, you cannot fake a real laugh. The famous director Jonathan Miller has said, laughter is not at all like a physical action. It's not like raising a hand or making a fist. It's not like writing or speaking. We cannot laugh at will. A good actor can laugh convincingly, but it's one of the hardest things to do, and when most people try to fake a laugh, it isn't convincing. So what is the point of humor? We laugh, but why do we laugh? Well, at first glance, humor is not practically useful. It doesn't provide food or shelter, and if it brings us love from friends and relatives or power over our enemies, this seems to be a coincidence, since jokes can also alienate the people we love and cause our enemies to become enraged and attack us. So from an evolutionary point of view, it's not useful, but it must be useful or we wouldn't have it. So we're going to try to look at some of what's going on. We like people, either friends or strangers, who can amuse us. It's very common for someone to say they were drawn to another person because he or she could make me laugh. You get this in personal ads. You want somebody who can make you laugh. I suppose, as opposed to somebody who can make you cry. We like cartoons, we like jokes, we like funny films, we like stand-up comics like the ones you just saw. So apparently, humor is something we want and something we need.
And it's, I think I'd agree with everything you're saying. I'd say so that sometimes the evolutionary positive aspect of laughter would be people who make other people laugh in a positive way are going to be popular and reproduce more and so forth, right? Back when they were making jokes on the savannah about whether or not the lions would come eat them that evening. But in our culture, it seems to me that very often humor can be divided into sort of harmless fun and serious attack. And once again, going to an authority, Mark Twain, in one of the pieces he didn't publish during his lifetime because he thought it was too potentially problematic for the authorities of his day, The Chronicles of Young Satan, he writes, "Against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand." The idea being that serious satire would, if you can make someone laughable, you make them unable to continue to have power. I think, once again, referencing the Bush-Cheney administration, this might not be the case. It doesn't seem always to work, although it might have worked with Tina Fey and Sarah Palin during the last presidential campaign. So humor is something we need, something we want, something that takes so many different forms, though, that it seems like there's lots of different ways humor gets generated and lots of different possible both sources for it and outcomes for it.
Well, people have been trying to explain how humor works for at least 23 centuries. And they've come up with many different answers, many different theories. And we're going to talk today about three main ones with examples. The oldest theory of humor is what's called the superiority theory. It was proposed by the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle back in the 4th century BC. They were both serious men, and neither of them really approved of humor.
Or of poets or creative writers.
Yes, right. Plato thought that laughter involves malice and can be morally damaging. Aristotle said that a joking attitude makes people unserious about important things. They both thought that we laugh when we feel superior to someone else. And this theory is beautifully symbolized by that classic signifier of humor, the banana skin.
Now, noted, no one laughed until she looked over and saw the banana skin. Right? So there's clearly there's a dynamic of respect whenever you're on stage.
Well, they're looking at me, and they don't notice the banana skin until I look at it, and then they look at you and see the banana skin. Somebody steps on a banana skin, we won't ask for volunteers, and slips and falls. Although if there's any actors present who would like to give a real-life demonstration, we'd be welcome to have them do so. And we laugh, according to Plato and Aristotle, because this person looks surprised and foolish, while we're still standing upright and looking calm. We feel superior to him, and this makes us happy. This is the superiority theory.
And it's also the classic definition of tragedy and comedy, which I've heard attributed to many comedians, which is if I stub my toe, it's tragedy. If you slip on a banana peel and break your neck, it's comedy. Right? So it's...
Depends who you are, if you're a friend or foe. In the 18th century, in Britain, the philosopher and political scientist Thomas Hobbes elaborated on this same idea. Hobbes thought that man was essentially driven by self-interest and, quote, a perpetual and restless desire of power, and that society consisted of, quote, the war of all against all. He declared in this quote, you all know, that in a state of nature, the life of man is nasty, brutish, and short. You can see what kind of a guy he was.
Not very tall.
Not. That's spontaneous. That's a wonderful example of spontaneous humor. Hobbes believed that we laugh and feel good when we see bad things happening to others. And he said, the passion of laughter is nothing else but sudden glory arising from a conception of some eminency in ourselves by comparison with the infirmity of others or of our own formerly. Satire is a well-known type of humor based on superiority, and it usually involves an exaggeration of reality to point out flaws and problems. Social, cultural, and political criticism often takes the form of satire, and so do cartoons.
Right, and here I'd just like to reference a text I'm sure you're all familiar with, which would be Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. The idea being, the surface expression of that satire being that in order to address the poverty of Ireland in the mid-18th century under British rule, that they ought to raise the children of the poor and eat them. The problem with satire is, of course, that some people don't get it. Right? People thought he was serious, and having taught that essay to undergraduates, they think he's serious too sometimes. So you always have to have sort of a surface level of serious plausibility, but a deeper truth, I think. And the truth was, of course, that economically speaking, the British were eating up the Irish. Right? They had laws that prevented them from holding political office or having manufacturers in their own country. All the money had to come in from Britain, and all the money went back out again. So
they were starving them.
Yeah, they were literally eating up their well-being, their very being. So that brings up a couple of issues regarding comedy that we'll get to, if not in the course of our talk directly, but in the Q&A, I'm sure. Part is the difference between people who get stuff and people who don't, right? And I'm sure everyone in this room gets it, right? Because we're all here together. But humor is just like jazz. And Louis Armstrong famously said, there's some folks, if they don't know, you can't tell them, right? You either get it or you don't. But this often has a certain national characteristic associated with it. And Mark Twain famously said that English humor is hard to appreciate, though, unless you are trained to it. The English papers, in reporting my speeches, always put laughter in the wrong place. Right? So he is, you know, when the crowd laughs at something he didn't expect them to laugh at, he thinks the crowd is wrong. Right? So you know, the idea that different humors or different senses of humor seem to exist in different national cultures is interesting, and it directly relates, of course, to your work, Alison, which often has this dual British-American thing going on. Yeah.
Well, the British, of course, are famous for satire, and they've been described as particularly favoring superiority humor. A couple of years ago, scientists surveyed 100,000 people in several different countries and asked them all what was the best joke they knew. And the jokes that won in different countries were different jokes. This is an amazing survey, and one of the only ones I know with a really large number of subjects. But here is the joke that won in Britain. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson go camping, and they pitch their tent under the stars. During the night, Holmes wakes up Watson and says to him, "Look up at the sky and tell me what you deduce." Watson says, "I see millions of stars, and if even a few of them have planets, it's likely that some of these planets are like the Earth, and there might be life out there." And Holmes says, "Watson, you idiot, someone has stolen our tent."
I see about a fifth of the audience not laughing.
This is one of the jokes of which there are many that has a hidden agenda. They're remembered and repeated because they express something important to the teller, maybe something that she or he can't express directly. Here, of course, the contrast is between scientific reasoning and common sense observation. Watson is exposed as foolish, impractical, and unobservant. We, like Holmes, are superior to him. We prefer common sense to theory.
Except at the University of Chicago, where we prefer theory to everything, or they, I should say. I do work here, sort of.
A lot of theory here?
Oh yeah, theory everywhere. They're underfoot. The idea here, of course, is always on some level about who you identify with in the narrative of the joke, right? Do you identify with Watson or do you identify with Holmes? Do you switch identification? There's always a sense in humor that's directly expressed the way a joke would be, that there's a test of personality or will going on. And this is one where you feel, you know, the first time I heard it, I was expecting, you know, a bear just come through the ceiling of the tent. I'm expecting some kind of American violence as opposed to British understatement. But it is, these hidden agendas also come up in different kinds of jokes that have other angles to them that we will be getting to shortly.
Hobbes had one interesting addition to the theories of Aristotle, and that is his idea that we also laugh at our own former infirmities, at our own past errors. And this is interesting because it might help to explain something you'll see and hear a lot of during this conference, a self-deprecating humor. Sometimes with stand-up comics, more than half of the material seems to be made up of jokes that put the joke teller down and show him or her up as foolish or incompetent. A comedian like Dave Barry, for instance, tells us how hopeless he was at fixing some household appliance, or how hopeless he was at dealing with a crying baby. He presents himself as more incompetent than most of us, and we feel good. We feel superior to him. It's been suggested that comedians usually do this at the start of their routine to diffuse the envy we may feel, because they're not only famous, they're getting a lot of money for just standing up in front of us and opening and shutting their mouth.
Which I might point out we are as well, although maybe not quite as much money as Dave Barry would get.
Compared to Dave Barry, we're like the groundskeeper.
Yeah, we're like the groundskeeper. We're the change in his couch.
Dave Barry would get a bigger audience, and he'd go home with much more dough.
No, not a better audience, though.
Not a better.
You guys are great. We're here all week.
Okay. Okay.
Well, and the superiority humor will be based on who you identify with. And here I'm thinking of stuff that I personally can't stand, which is the vast majority of sitcoms. The vast majority of sitcoms in America feature a husband who's overweight, likes sports and beer and TV way too much, a wife who's way better looking than he is, kids who are trouble, and that might be a documentary of most of America for all I know, but I do know that it sets up certain expectations about gender and about class that I just personally don't find that amusing, not that I'm humorless. I also don't like the sitcoms and the fact that there's always an A plot and a B plot that gets resolved in C plot. They're so formulaic that they're impossible, but they are based on an assumption that we will feel superior to Homer Simpson.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, but we may also identify. I identify with Lisa. Anyway.
The saxophone.
Anyway, when you get a comic stand up there, it's after they've lulled us into feeling superior to them, and thus feeling sympathetic and friendly, they often change their tune and start telling jokes against other people. Usually, at first, people that we would like to have jokes told about. But then they may begin telling jokes against some of us in the audience. It's an iffy situation for a stand-up comic. And some of them can make it, and some of them are going to insult first themselves and then the audience, which is going to not care for that.
Yet Don Rickles had a 50-year career.
What?
Don Rickles had a 50-year career doing insult comedy.
That's right.
Right? There's a special subgenre. And one thing you'll discover doing any kind of serious or comical analysis of humor is there's an exception to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I want to just give a last popular form of superiority humor, which is the light bulb joke. How many people here have heard a light bulb joke? Everybody. You know what there is.
How many people don't raise their hands in public when asked by the audience? Okay.
Yeah, well,
Just checking.
That's all right. You don't want to admit that you've ever heard a joke.
Right.
Who knows why. A light bulb joke makes fun of some type of person or group by highlighting what's supposed to be the less attractive characteristic feature or features. And usually these are people or groups that we're glad to have put down. Here's a couple of examples, and Bill has some too. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? I bet you know this one. Anybody want to volunteer?
Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change.
Did you hear that?
Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change.
Okay. How many egotists does it take to change a light bulb? One. He holds on to the light bulb and waits for the world to revolve around him.
However,
Okay,
I would also point out that light bulb jokes can be used to make fun of people who maybe don't deserve to be made fun of. For instance, and I say this knowing full well this may get me in deep trouble, how many feminists does it take to change a light bulb?
That's not funny.
Exactly. Thank you. I knew somebody in the audience would have the answer to that. Right, and that is the slur that feminists lack a sense of humor. I have no idea where that comes from. And of course, there's always the, you take any ethnic group you want and you can make the light bulb joke, right? How many Polish people does it take to change a light bulb? you know, 3, 1 to hold the light bulb and 2 to pick them up and turn them around, right? You can just do this endlessly.
They turn the ladder.
They turn the ladder, right?
Yeah, I believe. But
well, you know those people.
Well, the thing is, in Poland, that joke is told about Czechs.
And in any country, you'll have like regionalisms on this. In Ireland, they tell Kerry man jokes. So you know what happened when the dumbest man in County Cork moved to County Kerry? The average IQ went up in both counties. See, now you have to understand how averages work for that joke to be funny.
Okay, now we get to the second explanation of humor, is what has been called the incongruity theory. This is the idea that we laugh when we are surprised, when things don't match, and when our expectations are not met. This was the theory favored by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And the way he put it is that we laugh when we have the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing. What we get in these cases is what is called nonsense. Nonsense songs, nonsense skits like those in Monty Python, nonsense jokes, like the cycle of elephant jokes that became popular about 20 years. Anybody here ever remember hearing elephant jokes? Mm-hmm. You don't have to raise your hand because it has to do with you when you were born. Okay, I'll just read you one. Why do elephants paint their toenails red? The answer is so they can hide in apple trees. Then you say,
but I've never seen an elephant in an apple tree.
Well, you see, it works. Okay, this is nonsense. This is incongruity. You laugh because we're surprised. It's funny, but it's funny in a special, maybe even childish way. Jokes like this are very popular with kids, and according to experts, that's because kids have just realized that words are powerful. There's a moment when every child you've ever had or been realizes that you can use words to describe things that don't exist, to lie, in fact. And
we all forget this by the time we're adults, though.
Yeah, yeah. Now, nonsense, this kind of humor can be very useful. It's an escape from the very sensible, everyday world, and maybe it's a way of subtly criticizing it. It's about freedom from rules, about invention and play and fun. The most famous author of nonsense, of course, was Edward Lear, the 19th century British author of collections called Nonsense Songs and Nonsense Stories. Let's take his best known poem, The Owl and the Pussycat. How many people know that poem? Everybody. He did well. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. Now, why is this poem so popular, so well known? It doesn't make any sense. Birds and cats don't eat honey. They don't need money, and they can't sail. At least I've never met one who could. Moreover, birds and cats are natural enemies. But the owl and the pussycat end up happily married, dancing on a beach. So what we have here is a version of Eden, of the peaceable kingdom, in which the lion will lie down with the lamb. Incongruity humor tends to be upbeat, pleasant, fun. Another remarkable thing about this poem is that Lear never tells us which character is male and which is female, or whether maybe they're both male or both female, because they both take the initiative in the courtship. The owl sings a romantic ballad, and the pussycat suggests they get married. So it's nonsense, but it's also a very subversive kind of poem.
And on one level, it's ironic that humor only becomes subversive if we take it seriously.
That's probably true.
Right. The minute you start analyzing what's actually going on in this piece of nonsense, it suddenly has serious content to it. The best parallel I can think of for that is all these movies in the last 10 years that are based on superhero comics. right? And they're only good if they take it way too seriously. And then they can be a good movie as opposed to just a comic book on screen.
That's right, yeah. Some writers have said that what we often get with incongruity humor is not nothing or nonsense, but another system. And Arthur Koestler, the European novelist and philosopher, put it this way: it is the sudden clash between two mutually exclusive codes or rules or context that produces the comic effect. It compels the listener to perceive the situation in two self-consistent but incompatible frames of reference at the same time. This can involve what's called logical nonsense. For example, what has 4 legs, is big, green, and fuzzy, and if it fell out of a tree, it could kill you? Who knows the answer?
A pool table.
A pool table.
Billiards at the University of Chicago, pool at Northwestern.
Okay. Okay. In a way, this makes perfect sense. If a pool table fell on you out of a tree, it could kill you. But it's very unlikely to be there, just as an elephant. So when you hear the question, what comes into your mind is not a pool table, but some kind of huge, green, fuzzy monster. Another simple but effective form of incongruity humor is the pun, which is the sudden substitution of one system for another. Here's a joke you all probably know. How do you stop a rhinoceros from charging? Right, take
Indeed.
away his credit card. Now here, as in most puns, more is often going on than just a switch in frames of reference. This joke is about things that matter in the real world. For instance, anxiety about credit card debt. The feeling that you or someone you know, maybe your spouse or your child, it charges into stores like a wild beast and destroys things. For instance, your savings account.
And puns, of course, have been called the lowest form of humor. Edgar Allan Poe says the goodness of a true pun is in direct ratio to its intolerability. And Doug Larson says pun is the lowest form of humor, unless you thought of it yourself. However, there's also incongruity that just comes out of nowhere, like that. Two more words on puns. Thank you, whoever you were. Oliver Wendell Holmes says that a pun, while it may justify a physical blow in response, if that physical blow caused murder and it went to a jury, if the pun was bad enough, the verdict could be justifiable homicide. Fred Allen, on the other hand, says hanging is too good for a man who makes puns. He should be drawn and quoted. But I'll give the last word on puns to Ambrose Bierce, great American satirist and humorist. A pun is a form of wit to which wise men stoop and fools aspire.
Okay, so as you just saw, incongruity humor is about surprise. Something is said or something happens that you don't expect. It doesn't fit into the current system, which in this case is that of a speaker giving a talk to an audience. You don't understand what's going on. You might feel uneasy or even frightened. I gave a similar talk in Key West, and in that case, the person who came on in the orange wig, this absolute same orange wig that you've just seen, was my husband. Now, my husband is 6 feet tall. He has a beard and a ponytail. And as he walked down the aisle of the theater, some people didn't feel comfortable with him. This was partly because it was in Key West, Florida, where there are a lot of strange people. Some people got frightened. Somebody said, "Should we call the cops? Is there a guard here?" Then he came up onto the stage and he kissed me, and I introduced him as my husband, Edward, and everybody felt much better. And they laughed then because of the release of tension.
And the release of tension I had with this was fear that this poor lady who works for the Humanities Festival, who we roped into this, was going to slip on the banana peel that I threw in front that I completely didn't think of.
Oh my God! I thought we should have.
We should have warned her.
That would have been awful.
That would have been great.
Oh, she could have always.
Would have been perfect.
Oh, it would have been better if we'd asked her to pretend to slip.
Yeah, that's true.
Next time.
But I noticed that the majority of the audience didn't laugh or react at all because you weren't sure what the hell was going on. And there's always that moment.
Yeah, she should have walked slower, but never mind.
Well, okay, next year.
Next year.
What do you want from somebody we just roped into this?
I wanted, I wanted Paula Kahn to do it, but she
has too much class.
Too much class. Okay. Finally, the third way of explaining humor is what's been called the release of energy theory. It tries to explain laughter physiologically as a release of energy which is already present or generated by the joke before it gets to the punchline. And this is Sigmund Freud's explanation of humor. It's also been favored by other philosophers and psychologists, Shaftesbury, Schopenhauer, Bergson, and so on. According to them, we save energy when a joke breaks some taboo. The phrase most often used is the release of the repressed. The idea is that we're using energy all the time to hold down forbidden ideas and desires. Freud refers to sexual or aggressive jokes as outwitting the censor.
And here we get into some of the more interesting social areas about humor. You know, the idea, for instance, of ethnic humor, of humor about race or humor about gender, or humor about class, has had a huge evolution in our culture in the last 50 to 100 years, right? What used to be commonplace stuff, if you look at old plays that are comedies, ethnic and racial stereotypes and so forth, are now largely thought to be like subjects not fit for humor or not fit for polite humor. But we still have these aggressive energy-releasing jokes. They just tend to be at different, aimed at different targets. For instance, any lawyers in the room? All right, okay, yeah, lawyers who don't raise their hands? Now some more, okay. Lawyer jokes.
Lawyers are cautious. They're asked to raise their
They're not going to raise their hand unless the judge tells them to. Yeah. Will the defendant please rise, of course, being the other says. But there's a whole subcategory of lawyer jokes. And of course, all my friends who are lawyers say, yeah, you laugh until you need a lawyer. Then you want, the jokes, what do you get when you cross a lawyer with a pig? Nothing. Some things even pigs won't do, right? And sometimes the aggression can be against multiple groups, right? Two lawyers are jogging down on the lakefront beach path, two male lawyers, and they see a beautiful female jogger coming towards them, and the woman runs past, and the first lawyer says to the second, "Ooh, I'd like to screw her." And the second one says, "Out of what?" Right? So the question here is that joke more offensive to lawyers or to women? Judging it by the laughs at the end, I would say it's more offensive to lawyers. But it still was based on a sexist stereotype that treats women as simply sexual objects rather than as full beings. And I told that joke once and was told that I hadn't specified the gender of the lawyers. And I responded, "Does it matter?" Anyway.
Well, that way you get two groups that there's some prejudice against on the benighted people. You get them two in one. Yeah. Anyway, children like very simple and obvious kinds of release humor. 2- and 3-year-olds, if you remember back to when you had 2- and 3-year-olds at home, they think it's amazingly funny to shout "poo poo," and they'll laugh.
Apparently we got some 2-year-olds here.
Yeah, and they'll laugh out loud if they fart sometimes. It's the people who never get past this stage. There's a lot of crude release of energy humor around, and you can see it on T-shirts in some stores, the kind of T-shirts that probably nobody in this auditorium would wear. Or maybe they would. Is there anybody here who has on a humorous T-shirt?
I don't even see any T-shirts.
Nobody has. This is
a very classy crowd.
A classy crowd, but you walk down. What street would it be in Chicago?
Clark Street, Navy Pier.
Yeah, you'll see a lot of people with the crude release of energy T-shirts on. But most people, once they grow up and become more sophisticated, they still like release of energy humor, but they want it to be more subtle. They like jokes where the forbidden is only suggested rather than shouted outright. One common example of this kind of humor is parodies of popular songs. And we're going to end up with this. Here's an X-rated, small X, I think, maybe even R-rated version of A Christmas Carol, Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Some of you may know this. After this, we'll have questions and answers unless you want to add something. It goes like this. Uncle George and Auntie Mabel fainted at the breakfast table. This should be sufficient warning. Never do it in the morning. Ovaltine will set you right. You can do it every night. Uncle George is hoping soon to do it in the afternoon. Oh, what joys Aunt Mabel's seen with the help of Ovaltine. And these are the words that were sung to Hark the Herald Angels Sing by some children when I was young. And if they were if they were careful, they would not be overheard by the music director. They would be in the back row singing these words. Oh, what joys, instead of, oh, what joys the angels bring, we get, oh, what joys Aunt Mabel's seen, and so on. And they got away with this. And many of you will know parodies of popular songs that work just this way. And this is definitely a release kind of humor.
Right, and often that release humor, too, will be very cultural specific or temporally specific. My students today would never get this because they've never heard of Ovaltine. Right? They could get the sexual part, but they wouldn't get the hook of the popular song.
Okay, and also if you were brought up Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu, you wouldn't get the Christmas Carol.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's so there probably are, as far as I know, there's probably somewhere a Buddhist parody of a Buddhist hymn, but it hasn't been brought to my attention.
And if any Buddhists in the room would like to share that at the end, that would be good. I'd also point out that sometimes, though, this kind of humor can be very specific to a time and place. For instance, there's a parodic version of "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" that some Cub fans, meaning me and my friends, sing. Instead of "Take me out to the ball game, take me out to the park, buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jackets, buy me some peanuts and let's smoke crack." And instead of "If they don't win, it's a shame. If they don't win, it's the same." So these things are always being generated by folk culture, and whether they ever get actually written down or recorded, now it's recorded for posterity. So that's very important.
How do you classify knock-knock jokes?
Knock-knock jokes? I would classify knock-knock jokes as one of the children's jokes where you learn about the double meanings of words.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Sorry.
Yeah, knock-knock. I don't have a joke ready. I'm here for the serious stuff.
Thank you very much for your presentation. 30 and 40 years ago, people like Buddy Hackett and Red Fox were way ahead of their time using foul language. Mm-hmm. So many of today's comedians seem not to be able to do anything with it without outrageous language. What does it say about these times in our society?
Alison, should I?
Why can people not do anything without some?
Well, no. Why is I think the question is, why are today's comics, unlike Buddy Hackett, and I would use Lenny Bruce as the primary figure there, unable to use blue language or foul language except completely over the top, totally insane, and I'm not going to do it myself because there are people in the audience who would not forgive me if I did. Hi. But I would say that it's about how taboos have shifted. When Lenny Bruce got arrested here in Chicago for saying the word breasts on stage, we lived in a slightly different world as regarded what was considered acceptable language. He wasn't arrested for his really provocative racial stuff because he didn't get deep enough into his act to get to it that night. But think about that. In Chicago, there used to be cops whose job it was to make sure that comedians were clean enough. Obviously, there was not enough hippies to spy on or something. I don't know. And that was a Chicago cop joke that obviously no one in the room got. But I think that the evolution of American popular humor, once you break the hard and fast line between you cannot say this word, now you can, then the only way to go is up. The only way to break the taboo is to be completely over the top and use nothing but. And I'm trying very hard not to use any. I don't know why. I suppose I should.
Well, there are many racial epithets that you could use in the 1930s, and you'd be lynched if you used them now.
Absolutely. And this is true. This also gets back to one of the key aspects of the taboo humor and the humor of subject position, I call it, which is basically if you're in the in-group, you can make jokes, right? And one of the many great humor quotes I dug up in that authoritative place, the internet, is somebody saying that you haven't really made it in America until you can be the subject of humor, right? Because that means you're no longer being discriminated against. But it leads to lots of interesting dilemmas. I use a lot of humor in my teaching when I'm teaching writers who I think are funny, and I'm trying to get my students to understand that. And I talk about, for instance, remnants of our language that demonstrate prejudice from the past that we've forgotten about. I call this fossil prejudice. So, for instance, the name of the football team at Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish. Right? Now, that's the 19th century view of the Irish as inherently violent people. Right? Woody Allen tells a joke, and I have to put it that way because I'm not Jewish. I have to preface the joke by saying this is a Woody Allen joke. He said, calling a football team the Fighting Irish is like calling a football team the Haggling Jews. Right? Now, he can say that because he's in the in-group. I have to quote him saying that, otherwise it could be perceived as anti-Semitic.
That's right, yeah. But anybody can probably say the Fighting Irish now.
That's because we've forgotten that prejudice.
We've forgotten where it came.
Especially in Chicago, we run this place, so.
That's right. That's right. You just told me at lunch that Scotch tape is not known as Scotch tape in Scotland, but only here because when it was invented, the idea was that the Scotch were tight-fisted, and I turned to him and I said, "I'm half Scotch."
And I said, "Notice I said the idea was. I didn't say I believed it."
No, I mean, I even though I knew it was perfectly respectable for him to say this, and we're about to be together, yet in a way there was a sort of twitch in me that said, "Is he making fun? Is he casting an aspersion like a banana skin?" Yeah.
More questions, please. Don't be shy, because she's got to run up to you.
The possibility that and get your opinion about the idea that if a comic is self-deprecating, that it may not be so much or only putting themselves forward as an object of ridicule. You all can feel superior to me, but maybe in another way, a kind of taboo breaking by kind of winking at the audience and saying, we know that there's a way that we think we ought to be in the world, and here are the ways we fall short. Something about pointing out a gap between, like a gap in reality, and in fact pulling people in, and not just offering yourself as a sacrificial fool.
Yeah, I think that's a very intelligent comment, and I think that we laugh, but we're happy because we find out that some comic tells us that he can't understand his car engine, and we can't understand our car engine, so we feel a fellow feeling, and we don't feel so bad and stupid.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, let me point out that there's, which I actually did in my scholarship, whenever we think about things in culture that are as big and amorphous as humor, I think an important source of wisdom is cliche, right? Because cliches become cliches because they're endlessly repeated because there's some grain of truth to them. And the big thing about laughter is, are we laughing at you or with you? And that's a fundamental distinction that is about, I think, the breaking of taboos and when humor is aggressive. If we laugh with someone, we are on some level saying, we're in this together, I identify with you. If we laugh at somebody, we're pushing them away and objectifying them. And that's why so much racial and ethnic humor has gone to the wayside, because it's almost always, unless it's total in-group audience and speaker, it's almost always aggressive and objectifying rather than universalizing and accepting.
What's the punchline to the feminist joke?
That was the punchline. That's not funny, was the punchline. See now, like I said, Louis Armstrong. Some people just don't get it, right? Right there in the front row. Nothing personal.
What do you think about the idea that comedy is essentially conservative and tragedy is essentially radical, because the kind of response we get with comedy is, you know, we can be a little uncomfortable, we can laugh, we don't have to commit to change, whereas tragedy actually turns the society upside down and shakes it to its foundations?
That's a very interesting theory, which I haven't heard. I think it will depend on what the comedy is and what the tragedy is. I mean, you can say we see Othello and it tells us not to be suspicious of our wives just because what a guy we think is our best friend says she's cheating on us. So in that case, there maybe is a change. But there are other tragedies, like, for instance, Oedipus, in which everything just goes wrong for this guy. I don't think it's going to make us change. It'll just make us feel how miserable and terrible the world can be.
I'd also say that you connect with sort of the classical theories of comedy and tragedy there. The idea that comedy is about people who are lower than the members of the audience, right? And the sort of Shakespearean mutation of that being, you know you're watching a Shakespeare comedy when everybody at the end gets married. And that's what makes it a tragedy, if you ask me. But nobody's asked me. Over here.
Hi there. Thank you for that presentation. I have a question, actually two-part question about context and the rules, the implicit rules of what is funny or not funny to whom, not only societally or with a group. I thought that was a very funny poem or satire on Hark the Herald Angels Sing, but my mother died on Christmas Eve when that song was being played. I couldn't laugh at all. That's an individual response. The context of the woman coming with the hair, since you'd already done the banana peel, I said, oh, they've set this up. This is the second one. Wasn't funny. But it wasn't funny at all. How come the waterfall fell upside down? The smile to the frown. Anyway, so now
you want to come up here? We can get another chair.
No. But the question is a serious question for Alison. The difference between humor spoken in context and written. V.R. Lang, whom you've written about, Bunny Lang, you've once in one of the things you wrote, I laughed out loud when I read that section in your memoir. I was lying on a couch and I just laughed out loud. But was her humor, that when you knew her as a person, was it different in kind to the way she wrote when she wrote humorously?
Well, V.R. Lang, who was a friend of mine, a very good poet who died young years and years ago, she could write both tragedy and comedy, and she was aware of what she was doing, and she could see life as comic, and she could see it as tragic. So I think it's hard to say that that any piece of humor is going to work for everybody. For something that may seem very funny to one of you may seem tragic to someone else for a personal reason, like your personal reason. Humor is not universal, and I don't think it ever can be.
Total agreement. More time for a couple more questions? Don't be shy. Right? Okay, this is going to take some microphone passing.
What I wonder about is TV comedians like Jon Stewart, who I love, or Stephen Colbert, who I love. They throw in what just seems to be the F word, and everybody howls at the F word. Why is that so funny? I don't think it's not a funny word to me.
I'm trying so hard not to say it.
Yeah, I think this is an instance of something moving from unsayable to boring.
To punctuation.
I mean, if you people have told me that when you're in the army and in a war, this word which we are not uttering is the most common verb and adjective and adverb in soldiers' speech, and it gets to mean absolutely nothing. But the context in which it would mean a great deal. For example, let us imagine a wedding or a funeral. So humor depends so much on the context that you really cannot say that any joke or any word has a meaning always, but it's all specific.
And it also is something that, again, is context based on the discourse it's in, right? One of the things that makes Stewart and Colbert's humor work is that it looks like such a serious news set, but they can have this antic approach and they can cross these lines, but only because they're on cable TV, right? It's like seeing reruns of Sex and the City or The Sopranos on TBS. It's like 10 minutes an hour, right? Once they eliminate the visuals and the language that you can't use on broadcast TV, and this is often connected with, frankly, generational issues, right? What was forbidden 50 years ago is now punctuation. What's going to be funny 50 years from now? I have no idea, but I imagine we'll be talking about it at the Humanities Festival, if we have anything to say about it. Okay, we got about 1 minute left. If anyone wants any final, right here in front.
You mentioned your students wouldn't understand the Ovaltine parody. Mm-hmm. My name is Watson. How long will it take before Watson jokes become passé?
As long as Robert Downey Jr. is in the new Sherlock Holmes movie, my female students will know all about Watson. Yeah. Anyway, I'd like to thank the Humanities Festival and Polycon for sponsoring this event. I'd like to say it was an honor to share a stage with such an accomplished and great writer. And Alison Lurie, and thank you all for coming out.